We do begin with a disturbing story after a gruesome discovery was made on the city's east side, and we do want to warn you, some of these details may be hard to hear. Cleveland police say two young girls were found dead inside of suitcases again on the graves, and it all happened near a school. In the last hour, Cleveland police told us preliminary DNA tests show the two victims were half-siblings. New Yorker spoke with city leaders and police as they call for the public's help to solve the case.
Councilman Mike Polensek says he hasn't slept since the tragedy in his ward Monday evening.
I said to myself, oh my God, are there going to be more? Are there going to be, I didn't know. I did not know standing there last night in the cold.
Cleveland police say just after 6, they received a call from near East 162nd and Midland, right next to Ginn Academy. A man walking his dog found the body of a young girl inside a suitcase, buried in a shallow grave.
It was supposed to be an ordinary evening in Cleveland. A man was simply walking his dog across a quiet field on the east side of the city. The air was cold, the neighborhood calm, and nothing about the moment suggested that within seconds he would stumble upon something so disturbing it would shock the entire country. But then his dog stopped. It began sniffing frantically near a patch of dirt not far from a playground. At first, the man thought it might be trash or something an animal had buried, but when he looked closer, he saw the corner of a suitcase sticking out of the ground. Half buried. Something felt wrong. Curiosity slowly turned into dread as he approached. The suitcase looked out of place, dirty, abandoned, and partially covered with soil, as if someone had tried to hide it. He immediately called the police. When officers from the Cleveland Division of Police arrived, they carefully opened the suitcase. What they found inside made even seasoned investigators pause. Inside the suitcase were the remains of a child. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, but the horror didn't end there. As detectives secured the area and searched the field more carefully, they made another chilling discovery nearby, another suitcase. Also buried. And inside that second suitcase was another child. Within hours, the quiet neighborhood in Cleveland had transformed into an active crime scene. Police tape surrounded the field. Flashing lights filled the street. Investigators worked late into the night trying to answer one terrifying question: who would do something like this? The victims were soon identified as Mila Chapman, only 8 years old, and her older half-sister, Amber Wilson. Two young girls. Two lives brutally cut short. As detectives began tracing the girls' last known movements, every clue started pointing back to one person, the very person who was supposed to protect them. Their mother. Aaliyah Henderson, a 28-year-old woman from Cleveland, would soon become the center of a chilling investigation that left many asking the same haunting question. How could something like this happen? And what really happened inside that home before the girls disappeared? Night had already settled over the east side of Cleveland, but inside police headquarters the lights stayed on. Detectives from the Cleveland Division of Police worked through the night, carefully piecing together the first fragments of a story that already felt darker than anyone had expected. Two suitcases. Two young girls. Buried in a quiet field. The discovery alone was horrifying, but investigators knew the most difficult part of the job was only just beginning. Identifying the victims was the first step. Forensic teams carefully transported the suitcases from the field to the medical examiner's office. Evidence technicians photographed everything: the zippers, the fabric, the soil packed into the seams, even the small particles clinging to the handles. Every tiny detail could matter. Because whoever left those suitcases there had clearly intended for them never to be found. But they had been. And now detectives were determined to follow every clue. Within hours, investigators began comparing missing persons reports from around the Cleveland area. When young victims are involved, time becomes even more critical. Every department nearby was contacted, schools were checked, community alerts were quietly circulated among officers. Then one lead stood out. Two girls had recently been reported missing. Their names were Mila Chapman and Amber Wilson. Both lived in Cleveland. Both were sisters. And both had not been seen in days. The moment investigators saw the report, a heavy silence fell across the room. There was a very real possibility that the girls in the suitcases were Mila and Amber. DNA testing was rushed. Detectives began retracing the girls' lives, where they went to school, who they spent time with, who had last seen them alive. But almost immediately, another disturbing detail began to emerge. The girls lived with their mother, a 28-year-old woman named Aaliyah Henderson. At first, there was nothing unusual about the information. Parents are normally the first people investigators speak with when children go missing. It's routine procedure. But as detectives started asking questions, they noticed something that didn't sit right. No missing person report had been filed by the mother. Days had passed since the girls were last seen, yet no one had reported them missing. That fact alone was enough to make detectives uneasy. Because in cases involving children, the absence of urgency often raises more questions than answers. So investigators decided it was time to visit the home where the girls had last been seen. The address was located on the east side of Cleveland, near East 162nd Street and Midland Avenue, a residential neighborhood lined with modest houses, quiet sidewalks, and neighbors who had known each other for years. When police vehicles slowly rolled into the street the following day, residents noticed immediately. Word travels quickly in neighborhoods like this. People peeked through curtains, some stepped outside onto their porches, and what they saw made them uneasy. Detectives approached the home carefully. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary house. Nothing about it suggested the kind of tragedy investigators were beginning to suspect. But detectives knew appearances could be deceiving. They knocked on the door. Moments later, it opened. Standing in the doorway was Aaliyah Henderson. At first, the interaction appeared calm. Officers introduced themselves and explained that they were investigating a situation involving two children. They asked when she had last seen Mila and Amber. Her answer immediately caught their attention. She claimed the girls were staying with relatives. But when detectives asked which relatives, the answer became vague. Names weren't clear. Addresses weren't provided. Phone numbers weren't offered. And the more questions officers asked, the more inconsistent the answers became. Experienced detectives know when a conversation begins to shift from cooperation to avoidance. Something wasn't right. So investigators began quietly verifying the information she had given them. They contacted family members. No one had seen the girls. No one knew where they were. At that point, the situation quickly escalated. Detectives requested a search warrant for the home. Hours later, a judge approved it. When officers returned to the house, they entered carefully, documenting everything inside. What they found only deepened the mystery. The home showed signs that children lived there, toys scattered across the living room floor, clothing folded on chairs, school supplies sitting untouched. But there was something else investigators noticed. The house felt abandoned. Not empty exactly, but quiet in a way that suggested the children hadn't been there for some time. As forensic teams continued examining the house, detectives outside began speaking with neighbors. And what they heard painted an unsettling picture. Some residents said they hadn't seen the girls playing outside in several days. Others remembered hearing arguments coming from the home in the past. But no one could recall exactly when they had last seen Mila or Amber. Meanwhile, detectives reviewing surveillance cameras from nearby streets began noticing something else. A vehicle connected to the household had been seen leaving the neighborhood late at night. More than once. And on one of those nights, it appeared to be carrying large objects. Large enough to fit inside a suitcase. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together. Slowly. And disturbingly. Inside police headquarters, investigators compared the timeline of those late-night movements with the time investigators believed the suitcases had been buried in the field. The timing lined up almost perfectly. Now the investigation had shifted from searching for missing children to building a homicide case.
Police search warrant! Watch it.
Hands up! Come on down, hands up! Come on down, hands up! Come down now, hands up!
Bring it.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass her out. Anybody else inside?
Come here.
Got her? The girl down.
Got it.
Anybody else here?
Go ahead. You good? Okay. I got you covered. Just hold on 1 second. I'm gonna wait for the car to pull in so you don't have to.
1 second, I go.
Yeah, you're good. I got you.
Investigators were right. The truth behind what happened to Mila and Amber was not the act of a stranger. It was something much closer to home. And in the next few days, detectives would uncover evidence that would change this investigation forever. The tension inside the interrogation room was thick enough to feel. Detectives from the Cleveland Division of Police had spent hours reviewing the growing mountain of evidence spread across their desks. Surveillance footage, witness statements, timeline reports, every piece pointed back to one location and one person. Aaliyah Henderson, the same woman who had calmly opened her door just a day earlier. The same woman who had told investigators that the girls were staying with relatives. But the deeper detectives looked, the clearer it became that something in her story didn't match reality. And now, investigators were ready to confront her again. Inside the small interview room, the lights were bright, the walls plain, and the atmosphere uncomfortably quiet. Henderson sat across from two detectives, her expression calm, almost distant. At first, the questions were simple. When was the last time you saw Mila? When did you last see Amber? She repeated the same story she had told before. The girls were staying with family, they were safe, there was nothing to worry about. But the detectives had already spoken to those family members. And none of them had seen the girls. So the tone of the conversation began to change. The investigators slid a folder across the table. Inside were still images taken from neighborhood surveillance cameras. Images of a vehicle leaving the area near East 162nd Street and Midland Avenue in Cleveland late at night. The same vehicle registered to Henderson. The detective leaned forward slightly. "We know this is your car," he said calmly. For the first time, Henderson shifted in her chair. But she still didn't say much. Investigators continued. They explained that cameras from nearby streets had captured the vehicle multiple times over several nights. The footage showed something else too, large objects being moved in and out of the trunk. Objects that investigators now believed were suitcases. The same type of suitcases that had been found buried in the field. The room fell silent again. For several seconds no one spoke. But Henderson didn't break. She simply stared at the table. Outside the interrogation room, detectives continued digging into the timeline of the girls' final days. Investigators visited the schools that Mila Chapman and Amber Wilson attended. Teachers remembered them clearly. Mila was known as a quiet child who loved drawing. Her notebooks were often filled with colorful sketches, animals, flowers, and sometimes pictures of her family. Amber, the older sister, had a different personality. She was described as protective and mature for her age, often looking out for her younger sister. Friends said the two were almost inseparable. But when detectives asked the teachers when they had last seen the girls, the answers sent another chill through the investigation. Neither girl had attended school for several days. And again, no explanation had been given. Back at police headquarters, the pressure on Henderson slowly increased. Detectives continued presenting evidence piece by piece: phone records, surveillance timestamps, witness statements from neighbors who had noticed unusual activity around the home late at night. Each new detail chipped away at the story she had told them. But still she remained mostly quiet. Meanwhile, forensic teams were working inside the home near East 162nd Street. They photographed every room, every hallway, every inch of the property. And inside one area of the house, investigators made a discovery that would deeply disturb everyone involved in the case. Forensic technicians located items that suggested the girls had been inside the home shortly before their deaths. Clothing, personal belongings, and traces of evidence that would later become critical to the investigation. The atmosphere inside the house was heavy. Even experienced investigators who had worked countless crime scenes before felt the emotional weight of what had happened there. Because this was not just a crime scene. It had once been a home. The place where two young girls should have been safe. Outside the house, neighbors watched quietly from their porches as officers moved in and out carrying evidence bags. Some residents spoke to reporters later. Many said they were shocked. Others said they had always hoped the girls were simply staying with relatives, just as their mother had claimed. But now, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Inside the interrogation room, detectives made one final move. They revealed what investigators had discovered in the field where the suitcases were buried. Soil analysis showed that the dirt found on the suitcases matched the same type of soil found near Henderson's home. It was a small detail. But in a case like this, small details can become powerful evidence. One detective looked directly at Henderson and spoke slowly. Those girls deserved someone to protect them. The room fell silent again. Seconds passed. Then minutes. But Henderson still didn't confess. Instead, she sat motionless, her expression difficult to read. Eventually, the interview ended. Investigators stepped outside the room and looked at each other. They didn't yet have every answer they wanted. But they had something almost as important. Evidence. Enough evidence that prosecutors believed a case could be built. The following day, the decision was made. Authorities formally arrested Aaliyah Henderson and charged her with 2 counts of aggravated murder in connection with the deaths of Mila Chapman and Amber Wilson. The news spread quickly across Cleveland. Residents who had watched the investigation unfold from their windows were now faced with a reality almost too painful to process. 2 young girls were gone. And the person accused of taking their lives was the one person they had trusted most. But even with the arrest made, detectives knew the case was far from over. There were still unanswered questions. What exactly had happened inside that house? Why had the girls been killed? And what had led a mother to take such a horrifying step? Those answers would begin to unfold in the courtroom. Because soon, Aaliyah Henderson would stand before a judge at the Cleveland Municipal Court. And as the legal process began, the entire country would be watching. Morning arrived quietly over Cleveland, but the city no longer felt the same. In just a few days, the horrifying discovery of 2 suitcases buried in a field had transformed a quiet neighborhood into the center of a national tragedy. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse. Reporters gathered early, cameras ready, waiting for the moment when the woman at the center of the case would be brought before a judge. Inside the courtroom at Cleveland Municipal Court, the atmosphere was heavy. Families of the victims sat quietly in the gallery, some holding photographs, others staring silently toward the front of the room. For them, the pain was still raw. Just days earlier, the names Mila Chapman and Amber Wilson had belonged to 2 living, breathing little girls. Now they were the names at the center of a murder case. The courtroom doors opened. Escorted by deputies, Aaliyah Henderson entered the room. She wore jail clothing and walked slowly toward the defense table. The cameras outside were not allowed inside the courtroom, but every reporter in the building scribbled notes, capturing every detail. This was the moment the public had been waiting for. The arraignment. The judge reviewed the charges carefully before speaking. 2 counts of aggravated murder. The words echoed quietly through the courtroom. For many people sitting in the gallery, hearing the charges spoken aloud made the tragedy feel even more real. Some family members lowered their heads, others wiped tears from their eyes. The judge then addressed Henderson directly. Her bond would be set at $2 million. $2 million. It was an amount that reflected the seriousness of the charges and the gravity of the crime. If convicted, Henderson could face life in prison. But for the families of Mila and Amber, no sentence could ever truly balance what had been taken from them. Outside the courthouse, the story was already spreading across the country. National news networks were covering the case. Social media was filled with messages from people expressing shock, anger, and heartbreak. Many could not understand how something like this could happen. How 2 young girls could disappear without anyone realizing the danger they were in. And how their own mother could become the central figure in the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives from the Cleveland Division of Police continued working behind the scenes, building the case piece by piece. Arrests may capture headlines, but investigators know the real work continues long after the cameras leave. Evidence collected from the house near East 162nd Street was sent to laboratories for analysis. Forensic specialists examined fibers, fingerprints, and DNA samples. Every detail would help prosecutors establish exactly what had happened. At the same time, detectives continued interviewing people connected to the family. Relatives, neighbors, teachers, friends. Each conversation added another small piece to the story of the girls' lives. Teachers spoke about Mila's creativity and quiet kindness. Some remembered the drawings she loved to make during class. One teacher recalled how she once proudly showed a picture she had drawn of herself and her sister standing under a bright sun. Amer's teachers remembered her differently. They described her as responsible and protective, often looking out for her younger sister. Friends said she had dreams of becoming a nurse one day. Small details. But together, they painted a picture of who the girls were beyond the headlines. They were not just victims in a crime story. They were children with personalities, dreams, and futures that would now never happen. Back in the neighborhood where the investigation began, the community struggled to process the tragedy. Neighbors who had once waved to the girls while they played outside now left flowers and stuffed animals near the area where the suitcases had been discovered. Candles flickered in the evening air as small memorials appeared. For many residents, the hardest part was accepting that the crime had happened so close to home. Parents held their children a little tighter. Conversations in local stores and schools always seemed to return to the same question. How could something like this happen here? Investigators also began reviewing records from child welfare agencies to determine whether there had been previous concerns involving the family. In cases involving children, authorities often look back to see whether warning signs might have existed earlier. Sometimes there are. But in tragedies like this, communities often search desperately for answers. Meanwhile, Henderson remained in custody as prosecutors prepared the next steps in the legal process. Her defense attorney would eventually argue her side of the story in court. Prosecutors would present the evidence gathered by detectives. And a judge, or possibly a jury, would ultimately decide her fate. But for the families of Mila and Amer, the legal battle ahead was only part of the journey. Grief moves slowly. It does not follow court schedules or legal timelines. It lingers long after the headlines fade. As days passed, community leaders organized vigils to honor the girls. Hundreds of people gathered in parks and church halls, lighting candles and sharing memories. Children from nearby schools wrote letters and placed them beside photographs of the sisters. Many of the messages carried the same simple words: "We will remember you." For detectives who had worked the case, those moments served as powerful reminders of why their work mattered. Behind every investigation are real lives, real families, real loss. And while the legal process would take months, perhaps even years, one thing had already become clear. The discovery of those suitcases in a quiet field had changed the city of Cleveland forever. What began as a routine walk with a dog had uncovered a tragedy that would remain in the memories of the community for years to come. And as the case moved slowly through the justice system, many people continued asking the same haunting question that first echoed through the minds of detectives that night. What truly happened inside that home in the final moments before two young lives were lost? The courts may one day reveal the full truth. But for now, the story of Mila Chapman and Amer Wilson remains a painful reminder of a tragedy that shocked an entire nation. A tragedy that began with two suitcases buried in silence, and ended with a community determined never to forget the two little girls whose voices were taken far too soon.